Welcome to the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast. Today I'm joined by colleague and good friend Scott McKenzie from Pappas Consulting, all the way from New Zealand. Scott, welcome.
Todd, g'day. Thanks for having me on.
No, really appreciate your time, mate. It's wonderful to have a chat to our cousin brothers in New Zealand and get a better understanding of Trans-Tasman relationships, but also what's happening in New Zealand in commercial government worlds and so on and so forth. Thanks for your time. So, mate, we've had a few discussions, off the books around the relationship with Australia and New Zealand and the what's happening in New Zealand. There's been few big changes over there recently as well. What are some of your insights there, mate?
Hey, well, again, thanks very much for having me on. Love what you're doing with this podcast. So it's some great insights and some great people on, obviously, some great connections that you've forged there. Hey, New Zealand's in a really challenging place at the moment, post-COVID, with the splash for cash that the previous government handed out. We're sort of suffering a pretty severe hangover from that. And I think the new government that's come in, the national government, with Chris Luxon from a business background, is sort of putting that business lens across it and getting in and forensically going through line by line government agencies are doing, and that's having a sort of quite a big impact on us right across the country, and I think it's going to be interesting how that unfolds for just ourselves internally here, but also for how New Zealand and Australia sort of interact together.
Yeah, and Scott, mate, you've got a distinguished career in the New Zealand Defence Force, and you've transitioned into the commercial world, but also a commercial upbringing with your family's aviation business as well. So you've obviously got a unique lens to be able to see what's happening in the country from an economic point of view and a defence point of view as well. You touched on the new Prime Minister. One of my colleagues spent some time with him last week in Sydney and was super impressed. As you mentioned just then, a business lens on getting the government back in the black. Putting some proper KPIs in place like you would a business to drive outcomes. Some of the stories he told was amazing. Is that already rubbing off on the communities back home?
Yeah, it is, and we're sort of saying that they've sort of orientated themselves over the last almost 12 months and getting to understand the nitty-gritty of each government agency. And I think nothing's highlights it more than Health New Zealand, which was run by a board. The new government came in, they demanded a bit more. The board was sort of starting to shed people. I don't want to really be involved with this. New board in place, then a commissioner put in place with Lester Levy. Now I'm running the place effectively as a commissioner put in place, and now has a mandate to make some real changes, because they're effectively losing $130 million a month, which $1.4 billion a year. So, and they've got weekly meetings with the finance minister and the prime minister. So that's the level of detail that they're going through, and that sort of cascades right through the government sector, with a significant amount of job losses in that government sector, which some would argue has got bloated. And what does that mean for sort of the bigger picture stuff? For prior to the government coming in, there was a sort of a 2.5% reduction in budgets asked for. That's being sort of carried over, and a 6.5% to 7.5% reduction in the budgets required and how they go about that. So for defence, something that's sort of dear to our hearts, that means that they've had to make some savings internally, and they've been given some money for future platforms, but some of those sort of that money reinvested is $100 million worth of internal savings that have to be found and then reinvested into the business. So that's really challenging without actually losing capability, and it's not right across all government agencies. They're having to figure out what they're going to shed as back-end functions, or combine as back-end functions to get efficiencies, and then deliver savings, and that's bloody hard.
Mate, it is. I mean, it's interesting, especially with the population of New Zealand and the GDP of New Zealand. heavily relied in the past on agriculture as well. Obviously a net exporter of agriculture. What's the agriculture sector doing? Has it been affected by the change in government at all? Is there any uplift in government support?
The ag sector is, I suppose, is affected by the world economy more so than the change in government. There's elements of the environmental sustainability which affects the profitability at the present time, and a lot of the messaging that is around the methane emissions and the likes. But what really drives it is the price of beef and lamb, and that's sort of dropped through the floor recently. And so for us, from an aviation perspective and the ag perspective, there's been about half of the fertiliser has been applied this last season than the previous season. So that's the biggest indicator for us that we've got some significant problems. Fonterra is one of our biggest exporters, has just seen about a 6% rise in the recent global auction, which is great, but has had a bit of a downturn. So ag for us is, I think, on a bit of a precipice, not just withstanding the fact of beef and lamb, which feeds our population and is pumped across the world, but now that they're getting a higher return from planting our land and pine trees and the carbon credits that are involved with that, it's really going to be challenging over the next little while of how much do you put into pine trees versus how much do you leave as beef and lamb. And I think, from my little layman's perspective, is you've got to feed the world, right?
Yeah, mate, we're the same out here, obviously, in Australia, and, obviously pine trees and pine plantations, that's a long burn. It's a number of years before you get any return on a product, whereas obviously with, feed conversion ratios with beef and lamb and livestock's much less. There's obviously bigger injection into the economy on a more continual basis as well. Tell me, obviously, one thing to consider down there, your way there, Scott, is supply chain logistics and shipping. So New Zealand, we think we've got it tough in Australia, but New Zealand, a little bit further away from the rest of the world market. How's the supply chain been affected over the last 4 or 5 years? Is it struggling?
Look, the time frame to get, and I'll illustrate it with aircraft parts. The time frame to get aircraft parts to New Zealand is extended right out. Sometimes you can only find, for argument's sake, a short shaft for an engine. There might be one or two available in the world, and it costs you $40,000 US, and you don't need that for 8 to 9 months, but you have to make that. Spend that money in, say, February when you need it in November, and you think you're going to need it in November because that's the only one or two available in the world. Otherwise, you're going to have your equipment sitting on the ground. And I think that flows right through to everything for us. Just in ag for tractors and vehicle spare parts, right the way through. There's a longer lead time and a higher cost, which most businesses, that's a bit of a gross exaggeration. Some businesses are actually not forecasting that increase in costs. So what they charge today means that tomorrow they're going to be really struggling with actually affording to either replace that bit of equipment that fails, that part that fails, or reinvest in new equipment, which is a real challenge. So it means that we're going to have to work together. I think, this is where New Zealand is sort of just another, the size of one of your states, if not smaller. We're a third smaller in country size. The length of our country is the third smaller than WA. So we're about 1,000 miles long. You're about sort of 1,500 miles long in WA. And with a small state population. So how do we work together meaningfully to go out and be an economic force in the world? I don't know. What are you saying in Australia?
Yeah, well, mate, we're we're getting over that hump, but it's very similar because when you talk about just in case procurement versus just in time procurement, especially when it comes to spare parts, agribusiness, but also things like defence platforms as well. Being able to forecast that, and tying in any activity-based arrangements, deployment of platforms, be it agri, be it defence, be it health. The supply chain struggling because, like New Zealand, we don't manufacture anything here. We struggle, and we're at the the behest of large buyers of the same product. So we're competing. We're at the behest of production of producers because we don't buy as much, and we saw that through COVID as well. When it came to securing PPE, and as not much has changed in the fact that if he who holds the gold makes the rules. So if you've got more money and you're spending more with that producer, they're going to look after you first. We're seeing that down here still as well. We're seeing it in our defence platforms. We've got ships tied up because they can't be serviced because they can't get parts, they can't get people either. And I think that's fairly similar to New Zealand. It does beg the question, mate. What happens if we got together, Australia and New Zealand, and created a bit more of a combined buying force and a bit more of a, the southern superpower, so to speak? We'd have a good rugby team, number one. But we're doing it. Someone on the bench. We get one person on the bench.
Oh, I'm not too sure about. I'd probably bench most of your team. I don't think we'd have any Australia should come across and add value.
Maybe the water boy. We could be the water boy.
Hey, look, it's really interesting that sort of concept about how we could join together. And I think we've got to look at a little bit of our history. I think Australia does a great job at retaining some sort of sovereignty over manufacturing it, and but that has come with its challenges. So when you make a big acquisition, you say, hey, look, we want a certain amount of it made in Australia. That gives you some capability and reinvests that. But we've sort of seen that over history, and I'd say, the Black Hawk S-70A, MRH-90 Taipan, the Tiger, we've sort of followed on the Sea Sprite, the Anzac frigates. Yes. So we've sort of followed on from Australia to try and make sure that we've got interoperability. And I'd say with the Sea Sprites, that was an abject failure. The MRH-90, which is our NH-90, NH-90 is dear to my heart. I ran the introduction service for 3.5 years. So, and watched how that's played out. It's made it really difficult for us here in New Zealand because we've invested heavily and we have to make it work. And when we follow on, what sort of level of trust can we put into Australia sticking to that platform? And so this is where, let's say, for argument's sake, we were going to invest in, and we never would, but French submarines, we would be left holding the baby there as well. So it's really difficult to follow Australia because there's it changes. People change so quickly, and the ideas about how effective that platform is going to be for your future situation is challenging. An example would be our H model Hercules, where we thought we were going to be we were going to upgrade those, and we did upgrade those, and we thought we were going to be sort of number 300 on the avionics upgrade and other upgrades around the aircraft, and then we became number 1 to 6, or 1 to 5, and that came through, and all of a sudden we needed that upgrade, but we were orphans in the fleet. Now our Sea Sprites, we've taken on the Sea Sprites, and we're orphans. NH-90s, we're orphans. We've made it work, and we make it work, but actually we're in that bathtub curve for the Sea Sprites, especially the back end of that bathtub curve where we don't have the availability and the cost is massive. Yeah,
but it begs the question, mate. Like our procurement cycles out here in Australia, unfortunately, we end up with a camel, which is a horse designed by democracy, and by the time we put it into service, it's not required anymore, or someone says, actually, that's not what I wanted. doesn't do what we need it to do, and we invest all this time and money and effort, and people people have to fight it. So the warfighter, if we're talking just defence, the warfighter who has to fight it, it's either one, not fit for purpose, two, doesn't do what it needs to do, or costs an absolute bucket load. Especially when you talk about the sustainment piece, you're talking about the sustainment of a few platforms there that, it just doesn't make sense to have various platforms trying to do the same thing without the same support. So supply chain, logistics, spare parts, maintenance. It would make much more sense if if there was one platform, one program, for Australia and New Zealand, in my mind, because we don't have buying capacity. You've got the biggest small navy in the world, which is dear to my heart, the Royal New Zealand Navy. I love the New Zealand Navy, as with the Royal Australian Navy as well. Love them, love what they're trying to do. Some really good people trying to do the best they can with what they've got, but it's just not enough. And more is being asked of them by government. And this gets into a whole another topic, which we'll hopefully touch on later. But when you talk about national security, border security, and protecting our interests as well, both interests, New Zealand, Australia's interests, which are offshore.
Well, that we need to be able to project ourselves, right, and add to integrate with other forces, be it in the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, around Singapore, those sort of logistic lines of communication that we need to protect. That's sort of add value. I think, for us, for New Zealand and Australia, those are the choke points that we need to be able to project ourselves forward, whether it be on the sea or in the air, subsurface, to help project our influence. And we need to be able to help when we can. Huge resources in Australia that are attractive to other countries, and so that's something that you've got to keep in the back of your mind. But Australia and New Zealand are lucky with a massive big brother who's the biggest force in the world that is probably going to leap into action. But as we've seen, back in World War II, when you're fighting something on multiple fronts, you have to have a level of sovereignty that can, over your own force, that can mean that you can punch just as hard as a deterrent. So I think if we think about how we build our forces, one of the biggest things is I think we need to have the right attitude and know that each platform that we get is not going to deliver 100% of the solution. It might deliver 70% of the solution, and we need to exploit the strengths of that. And then it might be that you have the big booty stuff, we have the 30% of the solution, the other 30%, or we cover sort of 20-25% of that other part. And we do that bit well, and together we combine together to, like Transformers, we combine together to make something that's well worth while, that's going to project forward and add real value. And at the end of the day, we know that when we project ourselves overseas, our people just add such great value, and that's the attitude of how we do that that is really important. So let's ditch hey, it doesn't do this 30%, and we need to modify it, or we need to get another platform or a better platform that looks shiny. Let's go, hey, this is what we've got, and let's make it work.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. So, what's the new Prime Minister's view on defence? Is he, the last government ripped the guts out of defence, and it also affected culture. What's happened since the new Prime Minister's come aboard in New Zealand?
So we've got a new Minister of Defence, Judith Collins. She's a bit of a heavy hitter in the National Party, and so, but all of our ministers have multiple portfolios, so they're not really dedicated to one portfolio like more so you have in Australia, where defence is sort of a standalone almost. So I think that they're looking at the capability, and they're looking at right across, not just defence, but right across New Zealand, is what are they going to invest in infrastructure, and have an infrastructure plan that gives a bit of surety doesn't matter what sort of government is going to be. So you have, again, I'm making up a number here, but sort of 70% of what's going to happen over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years is sort of set in stone. And the expression session on either side of that, sort of the 15% either side is where the governments can sort of stamp their mark. And that means that we can spool up our industry to support, whether it be defence or roading or health. And I think, that's where we've got to end up, is have a good plan that can be adjusted, but it gives us some surety. And if we can do that with Australia and identify those areas that we can work together to get economies of scale, you can't go wrong.
Yeah, and mate, you've touched on critical industries there as well: health, agri, national security / defence. We haven't got much time left. To sum it up, how do you see Australia and New Zealand working together over the next few years with your new government as well to improve those areas of, let's say, interoperability and interchangeability and cooperation?
So I think building on the closer economic relations, building those relationships, having those conversations, and then, it's all well and good to have those conversations, but then what's the action we're going to take out of this? So being able to get some serious action points. And I think at the moment our government's sort of keen to work together and set the stage for that. And it's sort of the next level down, which is our level, is then what are the action points we're going to take to then drive this forward? And it means that I think we need to be cognizant that we need to maintain a little bit of our own sovereignty, but actually underneath that is that we support each other with the depth. So joint JVs are going to be the order of the day, and how that the profits from that are reinvested rather than going to the shareholders. I think over the next couple of years we're going to have to reinvest that in building capability.
Great. Hey, Scott, mate, thanks so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to catch up, and hopefully we can catch up again soon and grab some more insights from you around what's happening in New Zealand and the region.
That'd be great, Todd. Love what you do. Love your work across there, and keep in touch.